So I'm Laura Garcia. I serve as the Director of Career Education in the Career Center. Previously, before I joined Georgia Tech, I worked for about 6 years working directly with employers at various institutions. I've also worked as a career consultant in the past as well. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today comes from my background and experience working with employers from a variety of different industries and sharing what they've shared with me, what they're seeking from a variety of different candidate resumes. So we'll talk about the resume purpose, what you should be doing with it. I'll also go over the basics of resumes as well as some specifics that apply to graduate students, and we'll end on some best practices. To kick it off, let's talk about the format. Good resumes should show what you're good at and what you have done. This should not be a narrative of everything that you have done. This should be a selection of what best qualifies you for a particular position or types of jobs to which you are applying. This should highlight technical as well as career readiness or essential skills, things like teamwork, leadership, management skills. All of these are transferable. You should also be sure that you're containing keywords that start with strong action verbs like delegated, managed, communicated, oversaw. You get a lot of information in just one word alone, so try to avoid common phrases like responsible for or assisted. You're not getting as much information across as quickly as possible versus if you pick a stronger action verb. Within your individual sections, you want to have most recent information and then back in time. And as much as possible for each position to which you are applying, you should reflect the job description and change each resume to highlight relevant aspects of your background to make sure that you're marketing yourself as much as possible. Sometimes when I've worked with students, they've asked, well, I've got these different experiences. Should I have 3 bullet points for each, 4 bullet points, whatever it may be? And I encourage students to not give the same amount of space for all of their experiences, because if all of them are given the same amount of space, nothing in particular really stands out. So resume sections, I'm going to go over the most common resume sections on the left-hand side here that you see. So education, experience, skills, research, projects, and involvement. I'm going to include some more graduate student specific information towards the end of this. But there are a lot of other sections that you can add beyond just what we'll cover today. You can include study abroad, related coursework, honors and awards, an objective. I will show you an example of a summary of qualifications, additional information. The key thing to remember with a resume is that it is your marketing document. So you can label your sections however you would like, as long as it's pretty clear what the content would be within that particular section. Big picture, your resume should look as well formatted as the example that you see up here. So you should make good use of bold, underlining, all caps, italics if you want to use that as well. It needs to be scannable, and you need to make good use of white space. I know of some students that prefer to use tables to align all of your dates to the right-hand side, for example. I personally don't recommend that, but you're welcome to do that. If you use a table, you're limited as to how far you can extend your content. Once you've had a co-op, an internship, or other professional experiences, this should be listed immediately after your education section. If you don't yet have an internship, co-op, or other experiences that you can talk about, you may have to rely on projects or other courses that you've taken so far. Please don't rely on a Word template. I strongly recommend you just create a plain Word document because depending on the position to which you are applying, it can get more difficult as you customize and change your resume each time. So it's far better for you to have less tables, less formatting, so that way, again, you can adjust as you need to. Make sure that you create a master resume that's not limited by pages. So for undergraduate students, the majority of the time, you should have a one-page resume. Should you go onto a second page, be prepared that some employers will not go to the second page to read that content. So you need to prioritize what's most important on that first page. If you're struggling with keeping things down onto one page, I personally recommend you put a LinkedIn link up here, maybe a professional website, something along those lines. We had an employer participate in our resume reviews that we held about 2 weeks ago now. And something that they wanted to be sure to communicate to students is the importance of creating a plain text resume. And it's a brilliant tip. I think it's so smart. So I always want to be sure to include that in all of my resume presentations moving forward. If you haven't ever had to apply for a full-time job or a co-op or internship through a company website before, you may not have encountered this yet, but many times you have to enter your resume content into individual boxes. They may have an option where you can upload a resume and it'll automatically feed in, but many times there's a lot of issues with strange formatting. So once you've created your nice Word document resume, that I recommend, by the way, you save as your first name, last name, PDF, something professionally labeled. That includes your name and the type of document. It is helpful to have a plain text resume, so that way if you need to copy and paste anything in, the formatting isn't all wonky. So you may use things like asterisks or a little dash instead of a bullet point. All right, so heading. In your heading, you should include your name, your phone number, your email, perhaps a LinkedIn link or a portfolio, professional website. You don't necessarily have to include your home address, though you're more than welcome to do that. Most likely they're not going to mail you anything unless if it's, some sort of contract perhaps that you would need to sign, but a lot of employers are using systems like DocuSign, so you no longer necessarily have to have a print signature. But I do think it's helpful in particular for out-of-state students that may be trying to apply to positions in the same city where they're from. So the example down here, the student was from Beverly Hills, California. So including that they have a home address or a hometown there, they may be more likely to get picked by employers for various opportunities to interview. So you can see that some of these headings take up a lot of room. Some take minimal room, like Maria Hernandez here, example number 3. If you're struggling to keep everything down onto one page, you may want to do something similar to her, where you've got the location, phone number, email, or the professional website all on one line. But if you're struggling, perhaps you're a first-year student, second-year student, you may want to do something like David, the example number 2, so that way you're filling up more of your page. Education should be reverse chronological. So if you are a master's or a PhD student, you should have your undergraduate institution at the bottom, your Georgia Tech education at the top. You can also include transfer institutions if you're a transfer student, if you received a degree, certificate, or if you just mention involvement. If you have a GPA that's 3.0 or above, I strongly encourage you to include it. Some employers will assume you have below a 3.0 if you don't include it. Now for master's and PhD students, sometimes I've heard from employers that there's an assumption that, of course, you have above a 3.0 because you can't dip below a 3.0 as a master's or a PhD student. However, if you have the space, I think it can only help you if you've got a great GPA. So certainly you can feel free to include that. I've sometimes seen students include study abroad, honors, or awards, similar to these examples down here. So note you've got Georgia Tech, you've got the full degree title, GPA. If you don't have a GPA, say if you're a first-year student, you may not have one yet, or if it's your very first semester at Georgia Tech as a master's or a transfer student, you may not have it, but once you do need to add that in. And here's an example of a student who was a transfer student and received a degree from another institution and included some honors and awards in that education section. Experience. So this is where the majority of your effort should be in your particular resume. So your experience should be one of 4 things. It should be a skill, it should be an achievement, positive impact that you had, or something that you learned. So a skill, as I mentioned earlier, can be a technical skill set that you possess, or it may be one of those core essential skills like communication, teamwork, or leadership. And I don't want you to just list that you have strong communication skills, for example, because that's pretty subjective. It's far more impactful for you to say, I edited 5 articles per week for the student newspaper, or I presented to my student group, which has over 50 members each week. Public speaking and editing different articles are absolutely great examples of communication skills. However, they're very different skill sets. So it is far better for you to demonstrate that you have a particular skill than for you to just list it. Achievement. This could be if you are promoted, received a raise, employee of the month, or any sort of recognition. Impact. So think of this as how you improved the workforce or that particular student organization, volunteer opportunity. How did you make that place and organization better as a result of your work? So a couple of examples might be how you streamlined a process, you increased revenue, decreased costs, created a new process that increased efficiency by 5%. So anything that shows that positive impact is viewed very highly by employers. And lastly, things that you learned. So sometimes you might go into a shadowing situation with a professional. I oftentimes see that students that are interested in pre-med will do a lot of shadowing. However, oftentimes I'll see them state, shadowed cardiothoracic surgeon, which is great. However, I don't necessarily know, did you observe surgeries? What were the cases? Were you trained on HIPAA? I'd like a little bit more context around that. That will make you more marketable. But ultimately, within your experience section, as you're describing what you did, do not focus on tasks. If you do not want a job where you made copies, you're answering phones, where that's the main focus of your role, those shouldn't be things that you're listing. You'll need to focus more on the higher order skills that you gained through that. And I'll give a couple of examples in a moment here. It is important for you to put your most relevant bullets first, utilizing those strong action verbs in at least 5 words per bullet. And sometimes I'll get pushback from students about, do I really need to tailor my resume? Is it that critical for me to do that? Are employers really, focused on this? My response is yes, because you can never forget that to each job that you're applying to, you have been given a cheat sheet, also known as the job description. They told you exactly what they wanted from their ideal candidate, so you want to reflect that as much as possible. And this is one of the few times in your college career where you will be encouraged to plagiarize. It is okay for you to copy and paste and incorporate the wording from the job description for each position, because the first person that reviews your resume for a particular position oftentimes is not an expertise over, or is not an expert over your particular field. Usually it's a human resources person that hires for marketing, engineering, accounting, tons of different opportunities that are out there. So if they're given this particular list of qualities that they're looking for, you need to reflect that so you don't accidentally get filtered out. So experience can both be paid or unpaid. It can be in your field. It could be volunteer experience, leadership experience. What I oftentimes see that students do not include is scale, so numbers, dollars, percentages, but I would strongly encourage you to do that since so many students are not aware that that's something that many employers like to see. That's a great way to really stand out. So this, of course, again, will be listed after education once you've had an internship, co-op, research, full-time position, and it can be broken down into several different types. So if you had an experience maybe a couple of summers ago, or you had an experience in the middle that was lesser relevant, you could create a relevant experience section where you could pull from multiple experiences and put it in one larger category. And you might have relevant experience, additional experience underneath. But you can label it however you want to. So if you're interested in a job in healthcare and you have healthcare experience, you're more than welcome to list it that way as well. So I just want to point out just a couple of things in the bullet points here. So skills, for example, that I mentioned earlier can be both technical as well as those essential skills like leadership, teamwork, all of that. So in this first bullet point where this student had a media internship, I really like how they said that they utilized Adobe Illustrator to create magazine layouts and news advertisements for over 10 clients. So this is a great example of quantification. They incorporated technical skill set right in there. And even if you do have a separate skills section, I love to see it incorporated into bullet points because you'll get great experience through your courses and your academic training. However, employers love to see application in a variety of different industries or areas beyond the classroom if you have that experience. Note the bottom example is what some students may dismiss as, oh, well, I was a camp counselor or I worked in a restaurant. That experience, isn't valuable, or employers may not find that very marketable. However, that's where you need to focus on those higher order skills that you gained. So this camp counselor was promoted to a lead counselor after one summer and trained over 15 staff. They collaborated with fellow counselors to create activities for 30 plus children daily. And they exemplified leadership abilities by maintaining positive relationships with camp participants, parents, and staff. So note that they didn't focus on, I created arts and crafts projects daily with, whatever that age group may be that they were working with. So try to focus on those higher order skills and key takeaways. So most of you all on the call will have engaged in at least one, if not more, of these 4 core things that you will experience during your time at Georgia Tech, and you may have already experienced before coming here. So research. This is where I oftentimes see students make mistakes where they get so focused on the details of the research, but the language that they use oftentimes may not be as accessible to the reader. So some good transferable research bullets include how you may have facilitated in-person and phone interviews with 25 research participants. You performed a literature review. If you contributed to blank area of the research, which was published in this journal. If you compiled data using blank program and determined whatever the outcome may be. Great examples of transferable bullets. So part-time work. Instead of talking about how you made sandwiches or performed some sort of task, include something like this, where you provided excellent customer service to 50 plus patrons per shift, how you trained 10 new employees, how you accurately manage financial transactions on average of $1,000 a night. If you ever received a performance-based increase, that's also a great thing for you to include. Something to keep in mind, as employers are scanning over your resume, typically they only spend about 10, 15 seconds max with that first pass. That's why your formatting is so critical, because you're going to be compared to a lot of other candidates. So formatting is important, but beyond formatting, the next thing that employers look for is they look for patterns of behavior, patterns of achievement. So usually people don't get a performance-based raise if they have poor, work quality. So things like this can give a strong first impression on the employers that are reviewing your resume. So internships and co-ops. Here are a couple of bullets here. So perhaps a good example would be how they collaborated with senior leadership to design and implement a new wastewater treatment system, how they managed all social media accounts and increased Instagram followers by 10%, That's a great example of a positive impact that they had. Leadership, you can treat your student involvement or other volunteer commitments just like you do a work experience. And employers love to see leadership and student involvement, because not only are they hiring you for a specific role, they like to see well-rounded candidates that are involved in their communities and on campus as well. Here are some examples. This person oversaw a team of 5 executive board members to plan homecoming and other major events. They increased student attendance at blank event by engaging in new marketing tactics. They managed a budget of blank, and they personally raised this amount of money to benefit the Children's Miracle Network. So just a couple of bullets. Hopefully this will inspire you as you start looking through your individual resume and you start crafting your own language. So those skills that I mentioned throughout, of course, are both technical. They can be those transferable skill sets like leadership, teamwork, critical thinking skills, analytical skills. If you do have several different types of skill sets, I would encourage you to create subcategories similar to the example provided here. So this is more of a scientific example where they included their lab skill sets, instrumentation that they were familiar with. They also had some programming languages. They also, many of you all on the call may also know multiple languages. I think that's helpful to include. Just be sure if you include languages that you indicate your level of ability. And if you're not quite sure if you're fluent or not, it is far better for you to say basic, elementary, intermediate, to set the expectations low and to impress an employer. But if you say fluent, you never know when somebody may just suddenly start talking to you in that language, and you don't want it to be potentially a negative interaction. And you can list skill sets that you know that you will gain by the time that you ultimately would be hired with that employer. For example, if right now is a peak period for a lot of employers to recruit college students for a variety of different industries, I always encourage students to go to the Fall Career Fair, which will be happening next Monday through Wednesday. Details are in CareerBuzz and on our website. I strongly encourage you to be there. There are both in-person options as well as virtual. But it's important for you to include skills that you would gain now, even if you haven't taken a course. An example would be, it's a requirement for you to take Java in spring 2022. I might put down here Java, parentheses, spring 2022, because employers are already recruiting students for internship and co-op opportunities that may begin in summer 2022. So if you don't include what you will have by the time you would start with them, they won't assume that you will have that skill set if they choose to hire you or interview you. So research, here's an example of how you can incorporate some of your research. So there are some additional bullets that you could certainly scan through. What I oftentimes see and recommend for students that have research experience, please try to contain data, any sort of analysis. Why was your research important? What sort of impact is it going to have on the world? And oftentimes with research, you're likely not at the particular conclusion, or you don't necessarily know the impact that it will have yet, but incorporating some of this information into your bullet points will make them stronger and will stand out to employers. Projects. This is a great way for you to show implementation of skills, usually from class, but you can include independent projects or things that you've done on your own. This is a great section for first and second year students that are just getting started and don't have a co-op, internship, or other experiences yet. But even after you have, some of these experiences, you still can continue to include projects. The thing I recommend with that, though, is with your projects, just make sure that they're relevant to the jobs you're applying to. Otherwise, it's not as impactful as perhaps other sections. Leadership and involvement, this can be a list of all of your involvements, both at Georgia Tech. If you're a first or second year student, you can include high school information if you would like. Once you get past your sophomore year, that second year, that's when high school information would be removed. For graduate students, it would be okay for you to put Georgia Tech and perhaps your undergraduate institution and involvement there if you would like to do that. Keep in mind, employers want to see this. So if you are not involved in any student groups, please listen to what I'm saying today and please get involved. The students that I oftentimes find really struggling with finding a position, this is one of those things that they tend to not have on their resume. So certainly your major is important and academics should always be your top priority. But again, employers are looking for holistic candidates to hire, and they like to see those people skills and like to see that you're involved in some way, shape, or form at Georgia Tech. Let's just touch on a couple of things that are specific to graduate students. So the resume in general in the US, a resume is what most employers will use for non-academic positions. However, you will from time to time have employers or others utilize the terms interchangeably, CV or resume. The length may vary, but in general for industry resumes, if you're planning on going directly after graduation into a non-academic role, it could be 1 page, it could be 2 to 2.5 pages for master's students, potentially 3 to 4. It depends on your field. So government jobs, for example, you may have multiple pages for any federal positions that you apply to. For anything within research and development, higher education, those may be the types of industries where you have longer resumes, but you may have 1, 2, possibly 3. But just like undergraduate students need to prioritize their most important content on the first page, so should graduate students. All right, so here's some common sections that you will see for graduate students. You can include expertise. Some folks will label this as summary of qualifications, summary of skills. I'm going to show you an example of that. So typically that would be above your education for an industry resume. And this is your prime place to really focus on the transferable skill sets that you possess. And this would be the section you really want to customize for each position to which you are applying. Experience. You don't have to include everything that you've ever done, and that applies to undergraduates as well. So if you've had multiple part-time jobs, if you have relevant co-ops or internships, other experiences, it's okay for you to not include every single part-time job that you've had. Same thing with graduate students. You also do not have to include everything. You do want to emphasize the skill sets that you have, of course, research, projects, leadership. You may have publications, conferences, something along those lines. Here's an example of summary of qualifications, and I'm happy to send you all a more extensive handout where you can look through multiple different examples. But a summary of qualifications section is useful for individuals typically that have 5 years of experience or more, or if you're a master's or graduate student and you have extensive training, research, this may be helpful for you to quickly customize your resume for each position. So in this example, this student in their summary of qualifications, this is the first thing on a resume, right beneath the header and right for education. They emphasize their 6+ years of research experience and shared more information about the specific field. They emphasize their quantitative and analytical skills in, again, more specific industry areas. This is where reflecting on that basic qualification section on job descriptions or sections where they say the ideal candidate will possess A, B, or C. You can reflect that very well with your bullet ordering as well as the wording that you choose to use. They included how they were an author of 4 journal publications. They were an experienced lab manager. They incorporated some of their technical skill sets as well as language skills. Here's a sample graduate resume. I know this is difficult to read, likely on your computer. However, I wanted you to see formatting-wise a couple of different examples. So you'll be getting copies of these slides. You can feel free to look through that. So you can see the expertise section up here is very similar to the summary of qualifications example that I gave a little bit earlier. So for a CV, here's another way that you can format it. You can align your dates on the left-hand side if you would like to do that. Personally, I'm always biased more towards putting your dates over on the right-hand side, just because you have more room to operate with. If you follow columns similar to this example, it limits your content. But the thing to keep in mind about resumes and CVs is that it is a subjective thing. So there are a lot of different opinions that are out there. So what I'm talking about today are general best practices. But my preference is, if I'm the hiring manager, is right. You'll meet somebody else that may work at Coca-Cola, or insert your favorite company or organization name. And if they're the hiring manager, they may prefer other things that I don't prefer, and they're right. They're the one in the authority position that will make the decisions over who gets interviewed and who does not. So as you're thinking about future opportunities, make sure you're taking advantage of networking opportunities and putting yourself out there and understanding what are the specific things that you may need to do in this particular industry. So this example may be better towards an academic position, or if you network and start meeting folks in industry, they may prefer something more like this, which is more reflective of a typical industry resume. All right, a couple last things. So when you think about your particular resume or CV, think about what employers want to know and emphasize the most relevant components. Try to be who you are, not who you think they want you to be. Anything you include on your resume is fair game. They can point at a bullet point and say, well, tell me more about that. This is interesting. What was your experience like? Can you elaborate more on this particular point? Anything you put on your resume, you can receive questions about. So you need to be prepared and include information that best represents you as a person and a candidate. It's important to be honest for the same reason. So don't over promote yourself or fluff up your resume to where you may include content that isn't fully true. However, make sure you're not downplaying yourself as well. Oftentimes when I've worked with female students in particular, they tend to downplay their accomplishments. It's important for you to sometimes reframe the way that you're thinking about it and think of it as a statement of what you've done. So go back and demonstrate a skill set that you exercised, an achievement you had, how you made that workplace better, that positive impact, or other things that you've learned. Keep in mind, of course, companies are not just hiring you for that academic training, but it's who you are as a whole person. I encourage you to really put yourself out there, stay involved on campus, and if you struggle in certain areas, if you're reading through job descriptions, for example, and they're looking for someone with strong public speaking skills, there are student groups like Toastmasters where you can go and you can practice public speaking. So take advantage of the time that you have at Georgia Tech, exercise these muscles, grow as a person. It will really help you long term. A few other best practices that I wanted to include: do focus on being concise, focus far more over quality versus quantity. Just because you include a 3-page resume for a job description, that doesn't mean to an employer that you're suddenly more qualified than a student with a 1-page resume. In particular, for undergraduate students, I think it is far more likely for that to backfire on you. In general, the employer preferences I have heard over and over, with the exception of very few industries, is that they prefer 1-page resumes. But that's where LinkedIn.com, you're not limited by page length, so I strongly encourage students to be there. All right, so keep in mind the resume is how you market yourself, and don't forget that. That's where that master resume that's not limited to 1 page or any particular page length is so important. Keep that longer version of your resume, so that way as you customize your resume to individual positions, you can go back and pull bullet points that perhaps you excluded for other job opportunities. As you create these tailored resumes, make sure that you save them appropriately. An example would be Laura Garcia Home Depot resume, Laura Garcia resume, however you want to label it. It's okay for you to include either the job title or the company name in the file type, or the file name if you would like. And be sure you save it as a PDF. Please, please, please don't forget to save it as a PDF. Sometimes when you open up Word documents or other types of files, the formatting can go a little bit wonky, but PDFs will freeze that, so you shouldn't have issues along there. Try to avoid standing out with fonts, formatting, or colors. Exceptions to the rule would be if you wanted a career in graphic design, industrial design, architecture. If you're applying for a role in architecture and you're using Time New Roman font, for example, it would make you look a little bit out of touch, not as much of a designer, not as much of a creative person. So just keep in mind some industry standards, but for the majority of you all on the call, it's better for you to keep it a little bit more plain, with just plain black text, so that way they can quickly scan and easily locate the most relevant information. Work to continually expand your expertise, but make sure that you not only focus your resume on exposure as well as your expertise, and make sure that you tailor your resume content, again, as needed. I know I've repeated that over and over, but I think it's a common thing that students will not do. And ultimately, the students that I work with come April, they're still struggling finding a co-op, internship, or full-time role. Usually it's due to a couple of different factors. They didn't have their resume critiqued, they didn't search early enough, and they didn't customize their resumes. Usually what I'll ask when I'm working with students is, can you share a job description with me? If I can't quickly scan and see why you're qualified for that job, it's not going to be too surprising to me why you're not getting callbacks. I wanted to end on this last piece, and then I'll open it up for any questions you all have. I think it's important for you all to understand big picture what employers want when it comes to future competitive, what makes the ideal candidate for a variety of different roles. This was inspired by a conversation I had with a colleague in the Scheller College of Business who works with students all the time on a variety of career-related topics. And he said, inevitably, every year, Laura, somebody says to me, I didn't know I needed a 3.0 or above. Nobody told me I needed to be involved on campus. Nobody told me I needed to have an internship or a co-op or other experience before I graduated to be competitive. So as a result, this is why we're talking about it now. So you should definitely aim for a 3.0 or above. Be aware in CareerBuzz that employers have the ability to set certain filters GPA being one of the most common filters. So 3.0 is one of the most common ones. For some industries, it may be higher. For engineering, other industries, it may be a 2.8. And frankly, there are some employers that don't care about your GPA at all. It's more so, do you have the degree? Do you have the skills or qualities that they're looking for? Regardless of the major, you have excellent career prospects. Now, for leadership, you can lead from any level. This doesn't mean that you have to be president, and you don't have to be president of the coding club, for example, although that's great. You don't have to necessarily be a leader over an industry-specific student organization. You can be a secretary for the ballroom dancing club. You can do a lot of different student involvements. And I oftentimes find employers like seeing these unique things that students will do, like ballroom dancing, or there's some other sort of hobby stuff out there. I met a student the other day who shared that she's a part of Georgia Tech's barbecue club, which I thought was really interesting. I had no idea that existed, but it does. So sometimes it can spark a good conversation. You can develop good rapport that way. Experience. If you plan on immediately going into industry right after graduation, whether it's undergrad or grad, you need to prioritize industry experience through an internship, co-op, or other experience. On the flip side, if you're planning on going to graduate school, research or development related roles, you should absolutely prioritize research. Same thing if you have aspirations to work in higher education. However, you need to prioritize, and sometimes you can do all of these things or a combination of these. But it's important for you to do this for a couple of different reasons. One, it's a great way for you to test drive that particular organization, that particular industry or field to make sure it's a good fit for you. Also, it's a great way for you to become more competitive. So roughly at Georgia Tech, 75% or more of students, based on the research and based on our data, participate in a co-op or internship. So if you do not have that on your resume and you are applying for jobs in industry, you're naturally at a disadvantage. So please try to incorporate this into your experience at Georgia Tech. Those of you all that may be thinking, and there are students that think this, oh, I'll graduate in 3 years and that's what will make me most qualified to employers. And I would strongly encourage you not to do that, just so that way you put some time and energy into gaining that hands-on experience. That can really pay off for you long term. We partner with another organization across campus to gather some salary information from students that go immediately into industry after graduation, and our research has shown that co-op and internship students on average make a starting salary about $5,000 more than their peers who do not have industry experience. You can exponentially make more money over time by starting out with a higher starting level salary. So that's why I always like to emphasize it. And as you're going throughout your experience here at Georgia Tech, you're going to gain a variety of different skills, from communication to critical thinking, technical skill sets. But make sure that you are challenging and pushing yourself beyond academics to challenge yourself in those experiences, in your research and in your leadership experience. Put it all together, and ultimately this is going to be what makes you the most competitive pick for top careers in graduate schools. So I'll open it up to questions, but I want to be sure to end on this slide for a couple of reasons. We have a variety of workshops coming up, so if you haven't seen our Fall 2021 programming guide, be sure to scan this QR code here. I dropped it in the chat, but I would also love to hear what you thought about the workshop and if there's additional content that we could include in the future. And if you want to see additional examples of resumes, we have a resume guide. You go onto the main page of the Career Center, career.godtech.edu, scroll down, you'll see this icon. It will take you right there. So let me go back and see if we have some questions. All right, and we do. Very good. All right, let me open those up and we'll go back in time. All right, so this meeting is recorded and the PowerPoint will be shared. All right. So the question, would the BS MS program be an achievement? Good question. So you certainly could include that. And if you look in the resume guide, there is an example That shows a student that's getting a BS MS program. So likely that will stand out to employers, but you can also just reflect that in your education section, which will be one of the first things that they see on your resume when they scan through it. All right, next question was how to list experience if we don't have one. So if you don't have experience yet, I would encourage you to really emphasize your projects at this particular time, but you need to make a plan of how you can get that experience. And don't overlook that sometimes you can create your own opportunities. Georgia Tech has a great startup culture. I once conducted a panel at another university called Careers in Hollywood. And a student asked, well, how can I become a director one day? Because this was a panel focused on students who are interested in going into more creative careers. And the director responded, direct something, create something. If you want to be a developer, create your own website, create your own code. So try to put yourself out there. That can be helpful. There's also a great resource called Forage. So if you look up, just Google Forage Virtual Experience Programs, there are a lot of top companies who have created what I would call a hybrid between an online training and an experience. Sometimes they'll call it an externship. It's essentially, most of these experiences are about 5 to 6 hours in length. You can do it at your own pace. These are things that can add top brands to your resume, and that's a good half step before you get that internship, co-op, or full-time role. All right, so experience section, should that be in reverse chronological order? Yes. So most recent and then back in time. However, not all of your experiences have to be in one section. So if you have 2 really relevant experiences and you maybe had 2 other things that were lesser relevant in the middle, you could create a relevant experience section, bringing those 2 together. Then you could have additional experience underneath. Right, so are any internships we had in high school considered relevant? Potentially. In particular, if you're a first or second year student, if it is directly related to your industry, you could still include it. But if you're struggling to stay on the one page, if you're an undergraduate student, this is why I always tell students, always go back and include this information on LinkedIn. You are not limited by length on LinkedIn, so it's better for you to think of that as your comprehensive resume. You can get recommendations from previous supervisors. People can endorse your skill sets. You can upload examples of your work. There are tons of things that you can do there. And it's often used by many employers as essentially a resume book of passive potential candidates. So I've worked with students as well as graduates that have been contacted about a variety of different opportunities. So everyone on this call, you need a LinkedIn account, and anything that you're struggling to keep onto one page or you're considering eliminating, you can still include that on your particular LinkedIn profile. All right, so what sort of things should we put in experience if we haven't done an internship or worked with an employer before? So we kind of touched on this. You could emphasize your student involvement. You can emphasize your part-time work experience, and again, focus on those more transferable skills like working with money, if you trained people, if you exhibited excellent customer service, any sort of positive impacts that you had, and projects can also be another great thing for you to emphasize. Right, so I work a student job, but I have a leadership experience. Should I include that experience, leadership, or both? I would not include it in both. I would pick one. Typically, I see that separated from work experience. So you can label this type of experience a couple different ways. It could be leadership and community involvement, and you could have a couple of bullet points underneath, just like you would for a paid work experience. All right, so should a capstone project be included in experience or projects? I would probably include that in a project section. If you had a relevant experience section, it was directly industry related, potentially you could incorporate it there. But typically, if you have other projects listed, I think it makes more sense organizationally for it to be all in one particular section. All right, so how do we list or describe relevant coursework if we don't have any work experience? All right, so this can be directly in your education section. So underneath where you list GPA, maybe one of the last things you could include would be relevant coursework. The keyword being relevant, and please don't include things that are obvious that you've taken. So if you're a computer science student, I am going to assume you have taken an intro to computer science course. However, if you had an optional course that you didn't have to take and you were applying for a role where they had a needed, or they needed skills in that particular area or wanted training, then by all means include that, but please don't list every single course that you've taken. So when should we apply for most summer internships? Excellent question. I always recommend for students to apply in the fall. Not every industry recruits in the fall, and ultimately the working world does not revolve around college. However, a general rule of thumb is the bigger the company is, the earlier they recruit. Over the past few years, working with employers, I have found that more and more they want to attract the best candidates they can. So oftentimes they'll start recruiting students in the fall to try to beat their competitors and get those top talented candidates. So I've found most industries focus on the fall. Depending on their business needs, they may also recruit in the spring, or the world is a dynamic place. Sometimes you'll have new clients, new demand for services. So even if you don't line something up in the fall, there will still be opportunities in the spring. However, I encourage you to be early in the process, because you may meet an employer and they tell you, oh, come circle back to me in the spring, but you can't go back in time for those employers that recruit early on in the fall. All right, so would I need to join a club specific to my major, or would an organization like the Muslim Student Association be fine where I'm involved in interfaith work? Great question. So something to also keep in mind, many times we'll get contacted by employers who say, I really want to promote my biomedical engineering job. Can I get noticed? One of the top things we recommend is, hey, go to that biomedical student group. Likely they have, not too surprisingly, tons of students who have the skill sets that you need. So I think it's important to be in a place where you're likely to be found by employers. You're surrounded by people that are applying to similar opportunities. They may have employer speakers or other networking opportunities. But don't overlook student involvement like the Muslim Student Association, because it's a great way, again, to show that you're a well-rounded person. However, do be aware if you mention any sort of religious involvement, there can be discrimination. I don't want there to be discrimination. However, it can be very difficult sometimes to prove that discrimination happens by an employer. But on the flip side, there may be an employer who very much values your faith, has the same faith, and may have a positive bias where you may be selected. So ultimately, for students that are involved in political groups, that are involved in religious societies, I recommend, make that personal choice. Be aware of some things that could occur, based on whether or not you choose to include that. But if you feel passionately about that, if you would go to the workplace and feel stifled or not comfortable working in an environment where they don't let you embrace your true self, you don't feel authentic, by all means include that. In general, I recommend include everything. Politics and religion, it's a personal choice. All right, so let's see. So what's the difference between CV and a resume? For the career fair, I would focus on a resume. For graduate students, at most for a resume, I would probably pick 2 pages just for a career fair resume alone. I've often heard the example of including your paperclip instead of stapling, because it's easier for employers that they may go back and scan any of the documents that they received. But don't show up with 5-6 pages. It's just a lot of content for that particular employer to hold on to. It's likely to get lost. But in general, it would be a 1-page resume for undergraduates, 1 to 2 page resumes for graduate students, because again, this is your marketing document. Think of it as more of a flyer versus a comprehensive history of everything that you've done. Should I include hobbies outside of Georgia Tech? I've seen some individuals include, for example, in the additional information section, hobbies or interests that they may have. This is where it comes down to some people like it and some people don't. My personal preference is I don't like to see it. And the reason why is I would rather for students to include a demonstration of a transferable skill set that they gained, or include another bullet under an internship or co-op, because employers ultimately, if they want to get to know you, the things that you like to do, hobbies or interests, they're going to ask you about it anyways, regardless of whether or not it's on your resume. So I usually recommend take it off because you'll have other opportunities to talk about it. Okay, so if we have a letter of recommendation, should we combine that with our resume for the job fairs? I wouldn't for the job fair. However, I would upload it onto LinkedIn. So know that you can do that. Not only could you request for them to create a recommendation for you through the platform, you also have the ability to upload documents, and this would be a great thing for you to upload. All right, so how do I tailor my resume for a non-traditional career? Doctoral student with mostly a research background. The key is focusing on transferable skill sets. So that resume guide that I shared, as well as some of the examples shared in this presentation, even if it's somebody working in a field that is completely different than you, I recommend for all students to read through all the resumes that we've provided. Sometimes seeing that language may spark some ideas of how you also could emphasize some transferable skill sets. The key thing is for, in particular, doctoral students, you've got to de-emphasize things that traditionally higher education emphasizes. So if you focus too much on your research, too much on your publications, and kind of overemphasize that on your resume, it's starting to make the rest of your resume look imbalanced. You need to make sure you're emphasizing the projects that you've done as much as possible, so that way your resume feels more balanced. All right, so a couple more questions. All right. So question is, can we request a resume review for this week? We have drop-in hours Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. So if you don't see the ability to schedule an appointment through the Career Center through CareerBuzz, know that you can always stop by 2 to 4, Monday through Friday. It's in the Career Center. You walk into the Bill Moore Student Success Center, which is right by Tech Tower. Go down one floor in the basement level. You would just check in there, and our staff would be happy to help you. So you can do that through CareerBuzz by clicking on counseling appointment and setting up a time, or participate in drop-in hours. All right, I'm a second-year student who didn't really participate in student orgs, but I'm joining them now. So you mention them on your resume even if you just got started? Yes, absolutely. So keep in mind that the employers that you meet at the career fair or as you start interviewing, these employers, likely there's a process or there's going to be a couple of weeks that you go through interviews. So you meet them at the career fair, they'll likely schedule interviews the next week or two. That's usually first round, and then you'll have possibly second or third round. So there are a couple of weeks between when they see your resume and when you might get further on in the process. So you'll have more to talk about as the semester goes on. So yes, great question. Any tips for international students? So in CareerBuzz, if you pull up the career fair information, you do have the ability to filter by the question that we ask for all employers on registration: will you sponsor an H-1B visa? But what's challenging for international students is that employers are legally authorized to ask you one of two questions. So, are you legally authorized to work within the U.S.? So if you have the ability to work in the U.S. through OPT or CPT, yes, that's your response to that question. You are legally authorized to work in the U.S. If they ask, do you now or in the future require sponsorship? I personally recommend the international students to say yes, because the most complaints that I've heard from employers over the years is international students that don't answer yes to that second question. The reason being that there are different processes they may have to take you through in order to sponsor you. So if you have the STEM extension, you have a STEM degree, you can essentially work in the US for 3 years with that OPT extension. But keep in mind, everything I'm talking about right now, you need to work with the Office of International Education, and you need to become an expert over OPT and CPT, because you need to be able to explain it to employers and advocate. So there are some employers that aren't aware that international students can work in the US for 3 years, and you're legally able to do that. They don't have to do anything special, though you may want for them to put in an application for the H-1B visa. I recommend for international students to look through Going Global, which if you go to the Career Center webpage, find our career tools, you'll see an icon for Going Global, and look through our H-1B database. Many employers that have sponsored in the past would be, or they're typically more likely to sponsor in the future. But keep in mind, just because an employer sponsors, it may be for certain roles, but not all roles. A great example would be I worked with a Big Four consulting firm, and they would apply or they would sponsor students for technical consulting roles, but general managerial consulting roles, they wouldn't sponsor for that because it was more difficult. The students that applied to that didn't have a STEM degree, so they didn't have the same amount of time. Potentially, they could work in the US without getting sponsorship for H-1B. All right, what's the difference between co-op and internships? So co-ops, so the way that co-ops work is they are 3 rotations and they're sequential. So you co-op, go back to school, co-op, go back to school, co-op, go back to school. On average, it takes about 1 semester more to graduate, but many times we find students will do co-ops or take courses over the summer. So it doesn't really put you back that far, but it's really more a commitment of length. So internships are one-time commitments to an employer, typically 3 months. They could be up to 6 months in length. And you would register those through our office. We have plenty of upcoming workshops to talk about the co-op and internship program. I would strongly encourage everybody. Co-ops, you have to register through our office because you have to be enrolled in your audit hours in your co-op courses. Otherwise, you won't stay enrolled at Georgia Tech. So with your internships, the benefit of registering both of these regardless is that if you're on financial aid, income that you make that's related to a course, which you don't have to pay to take an internship or co-op audit course. It's just a certain amount of hours that you'll get as a part of that. It doesn't impact your FAFSA or potentially your financial aid rewards. There's some other benefits as well. All right, okay, so can first-year students, freshmen, be considered for internships? All right, so yes, you can be, but don't be surprised if you don't get selected your first year and don't get disheartened. That's where it's good for you to focus on leadership, focus on part-time work, get involved in industry-specific student organizations as well. How to market yourself is to do things that not everybody else is doing. Not everybody else shows up to the career fair. Not everybody shows the initiative to reach out to individuals they don't already have a connection with. So that's a way to be more competitive than upperclassmen who may not put forth that extra effort to make connections with employers. All right, so drop-in hours. Okay, so drop-in hours are open from 2 to 4 p.m. So when you're in CareerBuzz, if you click on counseling appointment and it says drop-in now, that will not be active until drop-in hours occur from 2 to 4 p.m. Monday through Friday. So if you click drop-in now, obviously nobody's working 8 o'clock at night, to handle drop-ins, and all drop-ins are in person. They aren't virtual. So that's where it can be a little bit confusing. But if you go to the Career Center main webpage, scroll down, you'll see an icon that says schedule an appointment. It walks through the instructions, how to sign in for drop-in hours, as well as pre-scheduled appointments. All right, so who can you ask for a reference? Can I ask a professor? You can ask professors, you can ask previous supervisors, advisors to a student group. If you worked in more of a professional experience, you could ask for recommendations from co-workers. But the key thing that I would recommend is if you're not quite sure who you can ask for a reference, make a commitment to build strong relationships because you'll need references moving forward for any career that's out there. So you need to build those relationships. People need to really get to know you to provide a good reference. The stronger the relationship, the better the reference will be. All right, so how do online students request a resume review? So online students can request a resume review. You just go to counseling appointment and you should be able to request an appointment. If you're an online master's student, I will say right now the graduate school advising team have a lot of graduate students that are already on their advising calendar, so you might have to wait a week or two or so to get on their calendar. All right, so another question. So if we have dual citizenship in another country, do we need to put that on our resume? Sometimes I'll see international students put, or other students indicate if they have US citizenship. For for a variety of different reasons. Some individuals believe if I put U.S. citizenship on my resume, that it may make me more competitive and it won't be assumed that I require sponsorship in the future. You can do that if you would like to, completely up to you. If you do have dual citizenship in another country and you know that particular employer has branches in that country or ties, maybe clients or products are from that country, there's some sort of connection there, by all means, feel free to include that. I don't think it would hurt you. All right, another question. Do you recommend we get a recommendation from a past employer before the career fair? I think that would be great. If you get a recommendation from a past employer, you can request that through LinkedIn if you would like, or if they write a formal written letter, you can also upload that and attach it to that particular work experience on LinkedIn, and I think that would be an excellent idea. All right, let me just scan